Jönne lama jönne yidang jönne kanro chujongde yenne sonde chanjo batu jömin jashin min zowe dedan batu jime daya duje jaju sonzula 谢谢这中恩主工作典籍中阿之颂。
Is the gateway to the Everest region. It's situated at 2,800 metres. It's actually got the dubious title of the world's most dangerous airport, and this is the start point of the trek, of their journey into the mountains.
So there was a wide variety of people in our group. You had people from early 20s up to close to 60. I just think it was amazing that you've got this wide span of ages, yet everyone can do it.
I didn't plan on going to Mera Peak. I mean, it was on my bucket list. It was actually physically, I have a bucket list, and it was physically on my bucket list. And it was down for 2014. It was meant to be next year.
So I've never done any altitude before, never done any sort of climbing or trekking or any of that, which is a bit of a shock to people when they first find out that this is the Mera Peak was the first stint at it. But I thought I could do it and did.
I've always wanted to go to Nepal, and probably my favourite thing to do is if someone puts a mountain in front of me, I'm just happy to climb it.
Yeah, the Mera Peak experience seemed to challenge my, I guess, my desires as to something different.
So it's been an exhilarating flight for people to arrive in Lukla. They've suddenly come from a relatively warm environment in Kathmandu to a colder environment surrounded by snow-capped peaks.
At the moment I'm in a really good spot. I've got a good job, I've got a good group of friends, family's great, relationship's good, and it was just, I wanted something that I could do completely for myself.
I actually employed Ben 3 or 4 years ago as my assistant when my actual assistant went on maternity leave, and pretty much from the start we became really good friends.
It's really intense there. Everything is just so much more exhausting. It's so much more difficult. Everything is just sort of, I don't know, amplified. So you get there and you think, oh, no, I'll be fine. But even just a tiny little sniffle makes you think, oh my God, am I going to get a cold?
The fact that it was completely on you. It's literally you in the wilderness and that's it. And that was really exciting.
The people in Nepal are so friendly, so funny, so much fun, and you learn a lot from them, and I really miss that.
I mostly feared the altitude in the sense that I didn't want to get sick, because my only other high altitude experience, I got food poisoning, and I knew how bad that was and how hard it was. I was really worried about that.
As we started the trek and got into it and met all the guides, down to the porters, down to the cooks, everyone was so friendly. Everyone was so friendly and funny. We had such a good time.
I was very cautious of how I was feeling every day. So I was trying to do everything I could to make sure that I just had this really good chance of making it to the top.
Even though everything was outlined for us on the trip, it was, this is where you have to be this morning, this is where you have to be this afternoon. We're giving you guys that bit of the leeway to make your way there.
Woke up this morning outside the tent, a little bit chilly, and look up, and it was the first time that we actually saw Mera Peak, so a little bit daunting, very exciting.
We are going to the Mera Central one, which is standing in the middle of the hill, mate.
Feeling pretty excited now that I can see the top of the mountain. Had a good night's sleep, feeling pretty warm, ready to get up there. Looks pretty good.
Through questions at Dean on a number of occasions about, are you tired today? How's your breathing going? And he was always fine. He never had a problem.
At the moment, I haven't really struggled at all to get where we've got to today.
He pointed out to everybody that he was a very competitive person.
I'm pretty competitive in all aspects of my life, I guess. I hadn't really ever thought that I would climb a mountain or be on top of a peak in Nepal. It was not something that I'd really entered my mind until a year or so ago.
I've only ever been to the snow once before in Australia, so seeing snow at all and walking on it was just, this trip was the trip of first. I have been overseas a few times before, but there's always internet, there's always a McDonald's, there's always Wi-Fi, and I just wanted nothing to do with that. Just wanted a month to myself to reflect and think and chill out.
They get to totally immerse themselves in the environment. That's incredibly important for us.
I think the thing I want to go home with is a lot more sort of self-respect and a lot more sort of inner joy and passion for, you know, my life in general as well.
Throughout the journey, a number of our clients became pretty clear were asking questions of themselves. Crystal I found particularly inspirational, given she was not able to go as fast as everybody else, and every day without exception she found herself last.
Crystal certainly showed a lot of leadership in the way that she persisted.
Almost every single day on the trip I was the last person in.
She may have feared whether she was actually going to complete every day, but despite how long it took, she pushed through.
A lot of the guys, had all these experiences walking near each other on the day, and I didn't get to be a part of that. Like, I was literally sort of separated.
She didn't have that camaraderie of the group that sort of existed, that you get every day with everybody walking together. And to do that every day over almost 20 days. And she was always bubbly, she was always happy, she never blamed anybody else.
And she'd had a fabulous day no matter what had happened for her or how much longer she'd actually walked than some of the others.
I think it helped that I'd already done a trek in the past.
If that was her pace and she was able to do that every day, then she didn't have a problem. She would be successful.
I knew that I had it in me to get to 5,500. So I was confident with that, even though everyone was sort of powering ahead.
At altitude, it gets hard.
Nice clean socks out to dry overnight. I'm not sure how they're going to get on.
The body tends to slow down. Your simple functions become very, very difficult.
And today, especially, the legs were willing, but the old lungs were sort of working reasonably hard at the higher altitude. A couple of years ago, Liz and I did Kilimanjaro climb. I'd got altitude sickness to the level where the guides didn't want me not so much climbing any higher, but spending the amount of time that would take to go around there and back, and I was sent down. People say you can always go back and do it again, but it's not the same as achieving it when you're there.
It is all about doing the hard yards beforehand in order to achieve.
It's a very non-negotiable environment. They have to work together in order to be successful.
We are a team, and I'd love to be able to get up there with everyone else.
I love food, and on this trip, our Cook Santa was amazing.
I have some particular dietary requirements, and I'd spoken to Nick about that before we left.
I didn't have huge expectations. There's only so much they can do. We were talked about, it was, what are the Australian team getting for dinner?
The food has been amazing. All my dietary requirements have been accommodated. I think some people have looked at some of my meals and been a bit jealous.
He did a birthday cake for Peter in Kare, about 5,000 metres. A birthday cake.
And Kare had experienced 10 days before this a record snowfall. We wouldn't normally expect to have snow at Kare, but on this occasion there was still about 4 or 5 feet of snow on the ground that the locals had to cut tunnels through to move from one lodge to the other.
I'm feeling pretty good at the moment. About 4 days ago, I wasn't feeling that crash hot after Zachala, and just feeling a little bit dizzy and a little bit nauseous, and after tea I got a bit sick, but after that little episode my strength has improved. I've been feeling a lot better, and so at the moment I'm feeling quite strong and ready to take the next stage up to Mera.
I'm not religious in any way, shape or form, but in Kare we all had to put a piece of gear that we were taking to the top of the mountain in. There was no shifting of the earth as far as what it went through, but it's good to be part of it and to understand the significance that it had on especially the guides. They believe that has an impact on the successful outcome of the trip, and maybe it does.
Some of the guides have climbed Everest 3 or 4 times, have done Mera Peak 22 times. It's like, we did it once and that was tough, but this is what they do on a daily basis.
Some of these guides are going back for trip upon trip. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for almost every person in the world, except the guides that are doing 3 or 4 trips to Mera in a season.
I don't think any one of us will understand how much work the Sherpas and the cooks and that actually put into making a success of the trip.
We had really weird weather conditions, and you can tell they were kind of confused by the amount of snow. They'd never seen it like that.
The first night going from Kare up to Mera, it's a physical day. Even though you can see where you're going from where you start, it's a big day, it's a big climb. Arriving to hike camp and seeing our tents perched on the side of this cliff and looking off this cliff to nothing. Everything was clicking the way it was supposed to. It was just a cohesive group doing what they knew they had to do.
Ben was pretty sick at that stage. He was suffering from altitude sickness.
The whole way leading up was, it's all about Mera Peak, it's all about the summit, but it was just, I had to eat. And if I wasn't able to eat, then I was going to have to think very long and hard about whether I was going to be leaving at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to make the summit.
And it was a situation where somebody who'd been particularly strong for the whole trip was just coming apart at that very last hurdle.
And by the time we got to high camp, his legs were numb.
The stomach reacted to the pain of my head. It was just vomit constantly. So Nick and Tigger had discussed with me whether I was going to leave the next morning for the summit.
Nick had told him, you just need to drink lots of water.
Nick was frustrated for me, just because I'd been so strong.
And I worked very hard to give Ben every opportunity to come to me and say I'm right to go, because throughout the whole trip Ben was up the front. He was strong each day. He made it into camp each day in good time. He was always in that front group.
One for Ben.
Left it in my hands that I would make that decision in the morning, and I fell asleep.
I didn't really venture out of the tent much at high camp just because I was concerned about his health and I was just keeping an eye on him.
And on summit night, the winds got huge.
So I woke up halfway through the night and the tent was shaking pretty violently. One of the corners had come off.
You could feel the pegs lifting up out of the ground, and me and Ben were just lying in the tent, kind of with our arms spread out a bit more to keep more weight down.
Then I fell back asleep and woke up to Dean's alarm going off. My head still thumping, and sort of laid there for 10 minutes.
There was a big focus on all of us, and Ben's focus would have been to summit. But he was clearly struggling with his health, with the altitude sickness.
But he ultimately made the decision not to proceed, to stay in his tent that night when everybody set off for the summit.
Whether it was a good decision for myself at the time, probably, physically. Mentally, obviously, I would love to have hit the summit. Everyone wanted to do that. Leading up to the peak was just building of a team. And the thought of me causing half of the team, or even anyone else in the team, to have to turn back is just so much worse than the thought of me not summiting.
His decision not to come, and therefore not to potentially have to turn around at some point, certainly contributed to the rest of us all actually reaching the summit.
But it was really tough to leave him in the tent, actually. Like, I started to cry a bit. I was, it was a year of training or planning this holiday, and to not be able to make that last little bit, like 6 hours of walking, was really hard.
We knew it was cold, but it was only once we set off that we really discovered how brutal the wind was. And the fact that I've got exceptionally good gear and that my feet and hands were getting cold really made me understand how it must have been for some of the people that were experiencing this for the first time.
Didn't come to a point where turning back was offered to me, and I was on my own. I'd chosen to go up an hour ahead of everyone. But it came to a point where I discussed the safety of myself with my guide.
I didn't know if this was normal. I didn't know if this is what we were expected to climb in. I started to get ready by putting on our Gore-Tex clothes, my down jacket, the harness.
The last thing in my mind was the actual walk from high camp up to the peak. It was more about we'd walked through some unbelievable snow the day before. There was occasions there where you would just have to stand face into the snow and just lean into it and wait for those big gusts to blow away, because it felt like you might just get flattened by it, knocked off your feet.
It was just so cold and windy. That's what I remember the most. You'd be on the line of rope, and the rope would be curved all the way out as far as it could go, just from the force of the wind.
And although it was extremely cold, when the sun finally started to peek over the horizon, I was just thinking to myself, when the sun comes up, it'll be warm.
As the sun slowly came up, we expected to feel a really penetrating warmth from that sunrise, which you often get in Nepal, but not a lot of warmth came due to the wind.
Unfortunately, it seemed to take hours for the sun to come up, and then when it did come up, it wasn't much warmer.
And all three of us were having problems with actually feeling our toes, and we were a bit concerned about that.
Lakpa was using ice axe to find the path. No one had gone ahead of us. The storm had covered up all of the paths. We didn't even know where the path was. So he just had his little ice axe and he just dug it in and was like, if it didn't go in very far, that was where we were stepping. And if it went in too far, he was like, yep, we're not stepping there.
I suggested, is this normal? Do we need to go back? I don't want to, as much as I want to reach the peak, I don't want to lose a toe over reaching the peak.
You get to a point where people have to be responsible for how they're feeling, how their feet might be feeling, how their core warmth might be feeling, and make those decisions. I had to have a difficult conversation with everybody that it was decision time in terms of their own welfare. I wouldn't have been at all surprised if half of our group had decided to turn around because of reasons of cold and the possibility of cold injuries.
If you're concerned about frostbite, you have to make a choice, whether you go back or continue. He goes, I can't make that choice for you, you have to do it. And he said it really with a lot of force and kind of yelling it to everyone. And it was a bit scary in a way, because it's the first time I really heard Nick kind of yell or, show that kind of force in his voice. And that kind of really made you think, okay, this is really serious. You could get frostbite from this.
This was a tough experience. This was an experience that, I can compare to being above 8,000 metres in terms of the brutality of the wind and the weather. So these guys really soldiered on and committed to what was required in amazing fashion.
I figured if I collapsed, someone would say, you can't go on. But while I kept walking and while I could keep putting a foot in front of the other, I suppose I just figured that, I was okay. So I kept going.
Lakpa is grabbing my hand and then hitting it with his hands and then rubbing them and then tucking them under his armpit to try and keep them warm. And he's like, you okay? And I'm like, and he's like, up? And I'm like,
I suffered on the way up. I don't know particularly why. I didn't have a very good climb. And a number of people made the remark that, that they didn't know why I didn't turn back. I was on my knees. I'd had a bit of a bug, coughing and that for a few days.
And Macca had been quite unwell. We'd been quite separated on the ropes, and I'd not really been aware that he'd been feeling quite unwell.
I actually was really concerned for his health. He was not responding to our questions. We were asking him. We'd have to stop every 8 to 10 steps because he just needed to stop. And he'd lean on his pole, and he'd be coughing and spluttering, and we'd be like, "Are you okay?" And he wouldn't even answer us.
If someone had turned back, then the guides thought that more than maybe 2 or 3 would have turned if one had gone back. And I think I was identified as probably the most likely, as I was struggling a fair bit.
we caught up at that point and we were talking, so everybody else went up and I was staying with him to make sure he was okay and that he was going to come up.
I realised that severely underestimated the amount of energy that it was going to take to actually get to the top of the peak. Yeah, maybe it was the Kilimanjaro experience that drove me through it.
So then it got to the last two of us, so I thought, oh well, off I go. And I can just remember thinking how hard it actually was trying to pull up the rope and move up the rope and climb the ice wall.
Well, I think they really believed that they were there to be successful. I think they'd already formed that belief that turning around wasn't an option. I think they derived a great amount of confidence from how well prepared they were and what we'd done with them in the lead up to make sure they were acclimatised, to make sure their skill sets were up.
I mean, I was tied to a man that's climbed Everest 4 times. I think he can handle Mera. I think he can make safe decisions about it. I trust his decisions.
And then when I got to the top, the view was incredible. You're just surrounded by mountains covered in snow, and it's just amazing to think where you are in the world and that there's Everest and Lhotse and Makalu and all these mountains there in front of you.
I'll never forget that day. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but one of my greatest achievements. But Nepal really kind of hit me, and I wasn't expecting that. And since I've come back, that's all I've kind of been thinking about. And I don't know how long it's going to last. Maybe it won't go away until I've gone back. I'm not sure. But let's see what happens in the future.
You know, it's amazing to think that you're nearly on top of the world, and it's just such a beautiful, peaceful spot, apart from the wind.
Like, everyone was exhausted and they were so honest with you about where they were at, how they were feeling. They put their weaknesses out there. You don't always get that honesty and truthfulness in the real world, and it's great. It was so refreshing, and that's why you feel so close to everyone afterwards as well. And my initial plan was to, snowboard from the peak. I just couldn't do it, and I still don't even see that as a failure. I don't even know how in my mind I thought, God, I'm going to be so disappointed if I don't snowboard down. It's going to be devastating. But then when I got to the top, the whole experience, it changes you, and it doesn't change you in a negative way.
Going to Nepal and doing something there. I've never had a real ambition to climb Everest, but I've always had an ambition or a goal to go to Nepal and do a trek or see the country. The added bonus, I guess, in some ways, being a skier, was that there's not too many people in the world that can say they've skied off a 6,500 metre peak and successfully got down after climbing it.
Yeah, so well before the trip, I had gone out and bought an engagement ring for my now fiancée, and that was definitely at the back of my mind the entire trip, just knowing that I was walking for myself and this trip was for myself, and that I have something so good to get home to. And the plan was that my housemate would have the engagement ring. I would see Tanya. As I was hugging her, he would slip me the ring over her shoulder, and then I would propose, and it couldn't have worked more perfectly. I admire people that have the ability to say they're going to do something and then do it.
The emotional journey and the emotional teachings often take a while to resonate. I think the reason for that initially is that there's such an enormous amount of physical effort going into what has to be achieved. A huge amount of mental, physical challenge has to be overcome every day in order to get your body safely to 6,500 metres.
Jai